Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. The air is getting a little crisper, and if you know anything about me, you know I love to have a fire in my fireplace. And we had our first fire last night. It was so nice to sit and have a fire and hope for the future. Tonight, we're going to take a look in Dr. Claypool's book, Glad Reunion, the person of Samuel. If you're like most people, you know that Samuel is a character in the Bible, but you really don't know a whole lot about his story. We tend to pick verses out of the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel to use in conjunction with New Testament stories, but we don't know, most of us don't know a whole lot about Samuel's story, and it is really, really interesting. He was born to a woman named Hannah, who was barren for a long time. And if you know anything about the Old Testament, women were looked down on for this. They had no way of knowing back then that it could equally be the man's fault for infertility, but women were judged very harshly if they were unable to have a child. And Hannah found herself in that situation, and in effect, what she did was she went to the temple and prayed to God and said that if he were to give her a child, then she would give that child back to be raised in the temple. And that's exactly what happened. She did end up having a child named Samuel, and after she weaned him, she took him to the temple to be raised by a priest there named Eli. Now, that part of the story is interesting, and it gives us a little insight into what can be a really elementary level of theology. This idea that you can make a deal with God somehow, so it can be a means to an end for you. And really, what is a deeper Christianity is just the opposite of that. It's being the process and let God choosing the end. So you being willing to be the means for God's choosing, not I choose something and help and hope that God will do something for us. But that is a temptation that we all have. He says this is a common temptation, and who of us has not done that very same thing? Establish a goal. More often we let society establish a goal for us, and our praying consists of bargaining with God to help us accomplish this. Biblical religion at its highest is something quite different, letting God help us establish the ends and offering ourselves as the means. Much deeper, much more important. The previous is infantile theology, and we want to grow past that. He says, however, the beautiful thing about this story is a note that you have heard me strike again and again in this book. God took Hannah's situation, selfish as it was, and once again brought something good out of the less than perfect. He met Hannah where she was in her cultural captivity, and nonetheless brought forth one of the truly great men in all of the Old Testament, Samuel. And really, this is the first goal of our church, is that we meet people where they are and let God begin to do the work regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how they find themselves. That's why we have such an open door at our church. We're not a country club. We're not trying to attract a certain type of person out there. We want for people to be able to show up and God meet them where they are so their lives can be transformed by their Christianity, imperfect as they are. Listen to how he words this. I love this. He says, God never has the luxury of pure motives to work with as far as human beings are concerned. Varying mixtures of good and evil are all he ever has at his disposal. But here's the good news that I so hope people who come to our church get. God can take just about anything and do just about everything with it. Isn't that incredible? That God can take all of the good and all of the evil and still be able to make wonderful things happen. So, we're now at the point where Samuel is being raised at the temple by Eli. And one of the interesting things overall in the Bible, it says Less negative is said about Samuel than any other major figure in the whole document. He says he became the spiritual leader of his people for over 40 years, presiding over their feasts, interceding for them before God, serving as a judge and arbitrator in practical affairs. And then there's this interesting verse that describes Samuel. It says, the Lord did let none of his words fall to the ground. It means that he was wise, he was insightful, and he was able to do what he was supposed to accomplish. He says he began a life that can be a model for us if we have the wisdom and perceive wanting to learn. So there's two things that he points out about Samuel that is important and impressive. One is the way he developed religiously. Here is a classic example of evolutionary rather than revolutionary religious experience. He grew all along the way. A famous minister, Harry Emerson Fosdick, said he crossed the stream at the narrowest place. In other words, his life with God was one of continuity and steady growth rather than upheaval and crisis after crisis that we hear about in so many other characters in the Bible. Very few of us have a conversion like Saul did when he became Paul, that Damascus Road kind of experience. Those certainly happen, and they get a lot of attention, but most of us are more like Samuel, a steady growth, saying in this instance that he crossed the stream at the narrowest place. So, very young, Samuel was growing up in the temple, being raised by a priest. He began to experience the great mystery of God, and he just began to say yes over and over and over again. He still had to make those decisions for himself. No one can make those decisions for us. We still have to make those decisions ourselves. But in a famous verse, Samuel is saying, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth." In other words, speak, God. I'm listening. I want to do your will for my life. So he tells a story about this woman coming to talk to him. Dr. Claypool has this woman come to talk to him. She had been to hear this big evangelist in town, and he had this big, turned his life around from alcohol and drugs kind of experience. Very compelling story. And because she didn't have a compelling story, she began to question her own. And he said, I suggested to this woman that if she could see what she would like to be at that moment, had she not developed with Christ across the years, then the difference the evangelist was talking about would have been apparent. She had experienced the Lord's transforming power gradually, but nonetheless authentically. And as Baptists, we all have our own experience. It can be a very intense one-time thing that begins our journey, or it can be a slow, gradual one. Neither one is more authentic than the other. He says Samuel is a prototype of a host of people who early in their lives were given an invitation to the banquet of God and who had the good wisdom to sit down quickly and start making the most of it. Now, the good news is that it's never too late to begin that. But also, it's important out, it's never too early either. It is never too early to begin to take one's place and start to grow. One of the reasons Samuel's words did not, quote, fall to the ground lies in the fact that he wasted so little of his life at these crossroads that he would come to. He just continually made the right next step. The way I like to put it is, our lives get complicated sometimes, but we just need to do the next right thing. The next right thing. This is what we see in the person of Samuel. He says, the other thing I find instructive about Samuel is the way he handled the process of change at the end of his life. He found himself having to live through one of those hinge areas. There was a big crisis for the Hebrew people at this time. So remember, up until this time, the Hebrew people did not have a king, and they were increasingly being beaten by the Philistines, who not only did have a monarch, but they had begun to use metal and make swords, so that their army was increasingly threatening the Jewish people. And so the Hebrew people decided that they wanted a king. And at first, Samuel said to them, "No, you don't. All of these bad things happen when you have a king. They take your men to fight and die in the army. They take your women to be concubines for the king. You have to pay all this money and taxes." And so he warned them of all these things, but he was flexible enough to know that change did need to happen. He says, there are always extremists on both sides, those who refuse to budge, and those who have so little sense of any value of the past that they'll throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, what I like most about Samuel is that he was not an extremist in either direction. He loved the old ways, as well he should have, but he also saw where history was moving and, and what had to be done unless everything was going to be lost. He describes it to, how the Native Americans were no match to the organized Westerners when they came, and their weapons and their organization. And this is where the Hebrew people found themselves at that time. And so Samuel eventually, kind of saw the writing on the wall, and he allowed them, and he played a big part in choosing their first king, Saul. And it's interesting to know that every single thing Samuel warned them about ended up becoming the truth. But he was willing to change at the end. And that's an important story for us. He ends by talking about this famous preacher doing a sermon in a community where a tornado had come through. And he said the only structures that remained standing, he noted, had two qualities: foundations and flexibility. If there was no secure grounding or connection with the earth, the structure blew away. By the same token, if there was no give, that is, if something were utterly rigid, the structure was demolished. He went on to say that the same qualities are essential for both the people and the institutions who are called to live amid the high winds of change. And this is exactly what I see Samuel doing so well. He had firm footage in the past, but he was flexible as well. And then he ends with these words, and are these timely or what? If you and I are going to survive in the kind of world in which we live, neither absolute conservatism nor total iconoclasm is likely to work. Roots and flexibility, these are the crucial qualities, and the way Samuel handled the last challenge of his life in its own way is as impressive as the way he began it. I hope this message has found you well. I hope that it gives you hope, and I hope you have a sense of peace until we meet again. God bless you.